What if one of the most important matriarchs in the Bible has been almost erased from history? What if her name is hidden in plain sight, tucked between verses you've read 100 times, yet you never stop to ask who she truly was? Most believers can tell you about Sarah, the mother of promise. They can tell you about Hagar, the servant who bore Ishmael. These names echo through Sunday school lessons, sermons, and prophecy charts. But Keturah? Silence. For many, she is little more than a footnote, an afterthought in Abraham's story, a name we skip over to get to the important parts. And yet, the Bible tells us she bore Abraham's 6 sons, 6 streams of destiny flowing out into the ancient world, 6 tribes whose echoes may still be heard today. So why don't we talk about her? Why don't we know her story? Why does Scripture tell us so little, and yet leave behind just enough to spark questions that could change the way we see biblical history? Who was Keturah? A forgotten wife? A mere concubine? Or a woman whose legacy still shapes nations and might hold a key to understanding prophecy for our time? Her story is short, but her impact may be vast. And if we follow the trail through ancient names, dusty deserts, and prophetic promises, we may find that the forgotten wife of Abraham is not forgotten at all. Stay with me, because the truth about Keturah might just rewrite what you thought you knew. About Abraham's family, the nations of the Middle East, and the unfolding plan of God in the last days. Before we begin, I want you to declare this boldly, either aloud where you are or type it in the comments. I will walk in God's truth and not be deceived. And make sure you subscribe, like, and share so more people can hear what's been hidden for generations. Let's go to the only place in Scripture where Keturah's life with Abraham is recorded in detail. Genesis 25 verses 1 to 4. Then again Abraham took a wife, and her name was Keturah. And she bore him Zimran, and Jokshan, and Medan, and Midian, and Ishbak, and Shua. And Jokshan begot Sheba and Dedan. And the sons of Dedan were Ashurim, Letushim, and Lumim. And the sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Hanok, Abida, and Eldah. All these were the children of Keturah. That's it. For short verses. No love story. No details of how they met. No mention of her background, her family, or even her character. Just a name and a list of names that follow her. And yet, these names are not meaningless. These sons became patriarchs of tribes. These tribes became nations. And in ways that will shock you, these nations have shaped the flow of history for thousands of years. But here's the question. Why is she barely mentioned? Sarah gets chapters. Hagar gets multiple scenes, divine encounters, even dialogue with the angel of the Lord. Keturah? For verses. Is this just an oversight, the result of ancient writers focusing on the main storyline? Or is this an intentional divine mystery, a breadcrumb trail left in the text, forcing the reader to dig deeper, to search through genealogies, to connect dots scattered across centuries of Scripture? Because here's what I've learned. In the Bible, what's left out can be just as telling as what's written in bold letters. And when we start tracing these 6 sons, Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua, we begin to see that Keturah's story was never meant to be forgotten, only hidden, until the appointed time. Genesis 25 verse 1 tells us plainly. Then again Abraham took a wife, and her name was Keturah. The Hebrew word here is Isha, the standard term for wife. It's the same word used for Sarah, for Rebekah, for Rachel. No ambiguity, no hint of lesser status. But then, we turn to 1 Chronicles 1 verse 32, where her story is retold in a genealogy. Now the sons of Keturah, Abraham's concubine, she bore Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. This time, she is not called wife. She is called Pilgesh, concubine, a word that, in the ancient Near East, referred to a woman in a recognized but secondary marital relationship, often without the full inheritance rights of a wife. So which is it? Was Keturah a wife, or was she a concubine? And why does Scripture use both terms? In the world of the patriarchs, a concubine was not the casual mistress that modern ears might imagine. She was a legal partner, recognized, provided for, and often chosen for her family connections or political alliances. Yet she did not carry the same covenantal or social standing as the chief wife. Some believe Genesis 25 verse 1 is simply telling the straightforward truth. After Sarah died, Abraham remarried. Keturah became his legal wife, and together they had 6 sons. The Chronicles writer, they argue, might simply be summarizing her position as one who was not Sarah, grouping her with women like Hagar for classification purposes. Others suggest Keturah began as a concubine during Sarah's lifetime, perhaps like Hagar, but after Sarah's death, she was elevated to the role of wife. This would explain why Genesis uses wife, while Chronicles preserves her earlier classification. In some ancient records, a woman who was not the first wife could be legally called a concubine, even if she functioned as a wife in daily life. It was less about affection or intimacy, and more about legal inheritance rights for her children. By this reading, the difference in terms may reveal how Keturah's sons were positioned in the family, loved, recognized, but not heirs to the covenant promise given to Isaac. So, was she wife or concubine? The text refuses to tie it up neatly. And maybe that's the point. Maybe her role straddles 2 worlds, one of covenant intimacy, another of strategic alliance. A woman who belonged to Abraham's household, who bore him nations, yet stood just outside the spotlight of the promised line. This tension, this question mark, is the first crack in the door. Because when we start following her sons into the pages of history, we may find that her secondary position in Abraham's household does not mean her descendants were secondary on the world stage. So keep digging, because the answer to wife or concubine might be more than just a marital status. It may be the key to unlocking why her legacy is so powerful and why it was hidden in the first place. In the Bible, names are rarely random. They carry weight. They tell stories. Sometimes, they even prophesy the future. Keturah's name in Hebrew, Keturah with macron h, means incense or fragrance, a gentle, beautiful image. But in the ancient Near East, incense was not just something for personal aroma. It was treasure. It was trade. It was temple worship. The Arabian Peninsula, stretching south and east from Canaan, was the beating heart of the ancient incense trade routes, the spice highways that carried frankincense and myrrh from the kingdoms of Sheba and Dedan up toward the Mediterranean and beyond. And here's what's intriguing. 2 of Keturah's grandsons, through her son Jokshan, were Sheba and Dedan, names directly tied to those incense kingdoms. Coincidence? Or a clue embedded in her very name? In Scripture, incense isn't just a physical product, it's deeply symbolic. Psalm 141 verse 2 says, "Let my prayer be set before you as incense, the lifting up of my hands as the evening sacrifice." And in Revelation 5 verse 8, John sees golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints rising before God's throne. Incense in the Bible represents worship, intercession, the sweet aroma of devotion lifted heavenward. So, could it be that Keturah's name, fragrance, hints not only at her connection to the literal incense trade through her descendants, but also at a spiritual dimension? That her lineage might, in some mysterious way, be tied to the fragrance of worship, or even to a prophetic role in God's plan for the nations? If so, her story takes on an entirely different tone. She is no longer just a secondary wife, no longer just a list of sons in a genealogy. Her name becomes a map, pointing to a legacy of trade, influence, and possibly even the spiritual currents that have flowed through the Middle East for millennia. And remember, prophecy often hides in plain sight. A single word, a name chosen in antiquity, and behind it, an entire future waiting to be revealed. If the Bible gives us so little about Keturah, where else can we turn? For centuries, Jewish and Islamic traditions have tried to fill in the blanks, some imaginative, some controversial, and some that raise more questions than they answer. Rabbinic Midrash, Keturah as Hagar. In certain rabbinic writings, an extraordinary claim appears. Keturah was not a new woman at all. She was Hagar, returning to Abraham after decades apart. The Midrash Rabbah on Genesis suggests that after Sarah's death, Abraham sought out Hagar, reconciled with her, and married her again. But this time, she was called Keturah, meaning fragrant, because her deeds had become as sweet as incense. In this view, her new name marks a transformation. The once banished maidservant becomes the restored wife, bringing her son Ishmael back into the family circle. It's a story of redemption, closure, and poetic symmetry. But is it history or allegory? In Islamic historical writings, Keturah's name surfaces in discussions of Arabian tribal origins. Some Muslim historians saw her sons, particularly Midian and Jokshan's line through Sheba and Dedan, as ancestors of key Arabian tribes. This fits neatly with the Quranic and Hadith focus on Abraham's wider family influencing the peoples of Arabia. If this is true, then Keturah's bloodline may stretch deep into the heart of the Arabian Peninsula, connecting her to the trade routes, politics, and even the religious shifts that would shape the region centuries later. But here's where caution is needed. Many scholars point out that these traditions, whether Jewish or Islamic, emerge long after the events they describe. The midrashic identification of Keturah with Hagar may be a moral lesson wrapped in narrative form, not an eyewitness account. And the Islamic tribal connections, while plausible, are often reconstructed from much later genealogical lists. The skeptic would argue, these are not records, they are interpretations. They may reflect the theological and political needs of the communities telling them, rather than the plain historical truth. So, was Keturah really Hagar under a new name? Were her sons truly the founders of major Arabian tribes? Or are these stories attempts to stitch together gaps the Bible deliberately leaves open? For now, we keep these traditions in the possible but unconfirmed column, fascinating side paths that may point toward truth or toward the human tendency to fill silence with stories. And the silence in Keturah's case? It's about to get louder. Because when we start tracking the 6 sons named in Genesis 25, we find ourselves standing at the birthplaces of nations that will reappear again and again, sometimes as friends, sometimes as foes, in the unfolding biblical drama. If Keturah's name truly means fragrance, and if her 6 sons became the patriarchs of powerful tribes, then her influence may have spread far beyond the tents of Abraham, and far beyond the borders of the Promised Land. These were not obscure, backwater clans. Some would control critical trade routes. Some would become wealthy through incense, spices, and gold. Some would stand toe-to-toe with empires. And some would become recurring figures in biblical prophecy, even in the end times. It forces us to ask, could the descendants of this forgotten wife still be shaping the world stage right now? Not just in the Middle East, but in global politics, economics, and spiritual dynamics? The answer is not just a historical curiosity. It's bigger, more urgent, and it will surprise you. Because when we map Keturah's bloodline forward through the centuries, we discover that her legacy is not buried in the past. It is alive, it is moving, and in some ways, it's closer to you than you think. We begin with the first name in Genesis 25 verse 2, Zimran. His name in Hebrew, Zimran, is often understood to mean musician or singer. It's a lyrical, almost poetic title, a striking contrast to the warrior-like names of some of his brothers. Could it hint at a cultural identity, perhaps a people known for song, poetry, or oral tradition? Where did Zimran's people go? The Bible itself says little else about him, but ancient commentators and historians try to place his descendants. Arabian hypothesis. Some early Jewish and Arab traditions place Zimran's people in western Arabia, perhaps near the Red Sea coast in the region later known as Hijaz. This would have put them along major caravan routes, rich with opportunities in the incense and spice trades. East African link. Other sources point across the Red Sea to East Africa, specifically Nubia or the Sudanese coast. Why? Because the trade winds and sea routes between Arabia and East Africa were already active in the Bronze Age. This means Zimran's descendants could have been among the earliest bridge people between the African and Arabian worlds, trading gold, ivory, incense, and exotic goods. Some historians have even suggested a link between Zimran's line and ancient Nubian groups, whose influence stretched up the Nile into Egypt. If true, that would mean Keturah's bloodline touched the heart of African history, from the Kushite kingdoms to the powerful trading hubs that connected Egypt, Arabia, and sub-Saharan Africa. This cross-continental positioning is significant. It would have made Zimran's people cultural brokers, moving goods, ideas, and perhaps even spiritual traditions between very different worlds. We must remember, when we read a single name in Genesis, we're looking at the seed of an entire people. And with Zimran, that seed may have been planted at a literal crossroads, a place where Africa and Arabia shook hands and exchanged treasures that shaped the ancient world. Next, we turn to Zimran's brother Jokshan. whose name is directly tied to two nations that will later dominate both trade and prophecy. The second son of Keturah listed in Genesis 25 verse 2 is Jokshan, a name meaning snarer or fowler. It evokes the image of someone who captures or gathers, a fitting metaphor for a patriarch whose descendants would gather wealth, goods, and influence from across the ancient world. His descendants, Sheba and Dedan. Genesis 25 verse 3 tells us that Jokshan fathered Sheba and Dedan, two names that echo loudly throughout both history and prophecy. Sheba, best known in Scripture for the opulent kingdom visited by the Queen of Sheba in Solomon's time, 1 Kings 10. Sheba was famous for gold, spices, and incense, treasures carried along the incense trade routes from the southern Arabian Peninsula, particularly modern-day Yemen. Dedan, located further north in the Arabian Peninsula, in what is now northwestern Saudi Arabia. Dedan was a caravan hub, connecting the incense trade of the south with markets in the Levant, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. These were not small, tribal outposts. They were trade powerhouses, controlling the flow of goods that made kingdoms rich and cities thrive. The Arabian Peninsula and Red Sea trade. Jokshan's family line sat strategically between Africa and Asia. From Sheba in the south to Dedan in the north, his descendants effectively managed a highway of wealth, the incense and spice routes that linked India and Africa to the Mediterranean world. This was a position of both economic power and political leverage. If you wanted frankincense for temple worship, myrrh for burial rites, or gold for your treasury, you went through Sheba and Dedan's territory. Biblical prophecy, Ezekiel 38, verse 13. Centuries after Jokshan's time, the names Sheba and Dedan reappear in one of the most dramatic prophetic passages in Scripture. Ezekiel 38 describes a future conflict often called the War of Gog and Magog. In verse 13, Sheba and Dedan are named among the nations observing the invasion of Israel, questioning the motives of Gog's massive alliance. Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish and all their young lions will say to you, "Have you come to take plunder? Have you gathered your army to take booty?" This prophecy places Sheba and Dedan in a geopolitical role, not as aggressors, but as voices on the sidelines, watching and questioning. It suggests that even in the end times, the descendants of Jokshan retain a distinct identity and influence in world affairs. From the incense caravans of antiquity to the pages of prophecy, Jokshan's line stands as a bridge between commerce, culture, and divine narrative. Our next figure is Medan, the third son of Keturah named in Genesis 25 verse 2. The meaning of his name is debated. Some suggest it comes from a root meaning strife or judgment, while others link it to a term meaning place of judgment. Whatever the case, Medan's identity has been overshadowed by his far more famous brother Midian, and yet his story is distinct. Some scholars believe that Medan's descendants lived near or even within the broader Midianite sphere in northwestern Arabia, east of the Gulf of Aqaba. This region was a rugged desert territory, rich with copper mining operations in the ancient world and positioned along vital caravan routes. The challenge is that the names Medan and Midian are so similar that later traditions sometimes blurred them together. But the text of Genesis makes a clear distinction. They are two different sons, and therefore two separate tribal lineages. Why this distinction matters? The Midianites appear repeatedly in Scripture, from Joseph's sale into slavery, Genesis 37, to Moses' flight into Midian, Exodus 2, and even in conflicts during the Judges period. If Medan's people lived near them, they may have interacted closely, sharing trade networks, intermarrying, or even being lumped together by outsiders. This could explain why Medan disappears as a named nation in later records. His identity might have been absorbed into the more dominant Midianite confederation. If Medan's descendants occupied territory along the Gulf of Aqaba or the eastern Red Sea coast, they would have been part of one of the most strategic trade corridors of the ancient Near East. Here, goods from Africa, Arabia, and even India could pass through, feeding into Levantine and Mesopotamian markets. And given that desert tribes often served as both traders and raiders, Medan's people may have played dual roles, facilitating commerce while defending, or taxing, the routes through their lands. While history remembers Midian more vividly, Medan may have been one of those hidden nations whose influence was felt in the shifting sands of trade, diplomacy, and survival in the Arabian deserts. Next, we move to Midian himself, a son whose descendants would become both allies and adversaries of Israel, and whose land would serve as the training ground for one of the Bible's greatest leaders. Few of Keturah's sons stand out in Scripture like Midian. Genesis 25 verse 2 names him fourth in the list, but his descendants would become some of the most recognizable players in the biblical narrative, sometimes as friends, sometimes as foes, always as a force to be reckoned with. One of the most famous Midianites is Jethro, also known as Reuel, the father-in-law of Moses, Exodus 2 verses 16 to 21. Jethro wasn't just a tribal elder. He was called a priest of Midian. This means the Midianites had an established religious structure, and Jethro himself recognized the God of Israel as supreme, Exodus 18 verses 10 to 12. It was in the land of Midian, in the wilderness near Mount Horeb, that Moses encountered the burning bush and received his divine calling. This places the Midianites directly in the path of God's redemptive plan for Israel. But the Midianites' relationship with Israel was far from consistent. As allies, Jethro advised Moses on governing the people, offering wise counsel that shaped Israel's early leadership structure. As enemies, in Numbers 25, Midianite influence led Israel into idolatry and immorality, provoking God's judgment. Later, in Numbers 31, Israel fought and defeated Midianite forces under God's command. This dual role, sometimes helping, sometimes opposing, made the Midianites a complex neighbor for Israel. Midianite territory stretched along the northwestern Arabian Peninsula, from the Gulf of Aqaba southward. They controlled routes that connected Egypt to Arabia and the Levant. Archaeological evidence of Midianite pottery, metallurgy, and trade shows they were far more advanced than a nomadic stereotype would suggest. Centuries later, the prophet Isaiah invokes Midian in a remarkable end-times vision. In Isaiah 60 verse 6, speaking of the future glory of Zion, he says, "A multitude of camels shall cover you. The young camels of Midian and Ephah, all those from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and frankincense, and shall proclaim the praises of the Lord." Here, Midian is not an enemy, but part of a great procession bringing tribute and worship to the restored Jerusalem. It's a stunning reversal from the days of conflict in Numbers, a prophetic glimpse of reconciliation and participation in God's final plan. From the deserts of Moses' exile to the visions of Isaiah, Midian's story shows the unpredictable but sovereign weaving of God's purposes. They remind us that a people's role in history can change, from adversary to ally, from obstacle to worshiper, when God writes the script. Next, we'll meet Ishbak, a name barely mentioned in the Bible, but possibly linked to one of the most elusive ancient peoples of the Near East. The name itself is like a whisper of departure. Ishbak. He will leave. One of Abraham's lesser-known sons through Keturah, Ishbak's story is not told in detail. No list of mighty deeds. No epic battles. Just a name in the genealogical scroll, almost as if he walked quietly off the stage of history. But the absence of detail often invites the deepest mysteries. Some scholars link Ishbak's descendants to the Syrian or northern Arabian tribes, nomadic people who thrived in the spaces between empires. These were the wanderers who knew how to survive in barren deserts, moving with the wind, trading between kingdoms, leaving behind little but their tracks in the sand. And maybe that is his legacy, movement. A people not bound to one land, but woven into many. A lineage that could fade from one nation's history while quietly shaping another's. What does it mean to be the one who leaves? To not remain in the safety of home, but to venture beyond the horizon, perhaps forgotten by name, yet remembered in influence. Ishbak's life reminds us that God's plans are not always about being planted in one place. Sometimes, his calling is to go, to carry his promise into unknown lands, to scatter the seeds of faith where others will one day harvest. Like Ishbak, some of us are written only briefly in the records of men, but in the records of heaven, our journey might be far longer and far more impactful than anyone could see. The final name in Keturah's list of 6 sons is Shua, a name meaning depression or pit in Hebrew, but possibly carrying the sense of a lowland region. Shua surfaces again in the Bible in a surprising place, in the book of Job. One of Job's friends, Bildad the Shuhite, was almost certainly a descendant of Shua. That means Shua's lineage was still active and recognizable generations later, known enough to be identified by tribal origin. Many scholars place Shua's descendants in the northern Arabian desert or southern Mesopotamia, along the Euphrates River basin. This location was strategically important, a bridge between the wealthy cities of Babylon and Ur and the rugged trade routes leading toward the Levant and Arabian Peninsula. It also meant Shua's people would have been in contact with, and sometimes under the sway of, powerful empires like Assyria and Babylon. These interactions would shape their politics, culture, and perhaps even their spiritual beliefs. Other traditions suggest that Shua's descendants spread westward, closer to Edomite territory in what is now southern Jordan. If so, this would put them directly in the path of Israel's later history. Close neighbors, sometimes allies, sometimes rivals. Shua's people may not dominate the headlines of biblical history, but the appearance of Bildad in Job's narrative is telling. It suggests that Shua's line carried enough prestige, wisdom, and cultural influence that one of his descendants could stand in dialogue with one of Scripture's most famous figures of suffering and faith. Even from the lowland of his name, Shua's legacy reminds us that God weaves his purposes through both the mountain peaks of history and the valleys that the world tends to overlook. With Shua, the roll call of Keturah's sons is complete. 6 men, 6 bloodlines, each branching into nations and tribes that would shape trade, culture, and even prophecy for centuries to come. But what happens when we trace those branches forward, all the way into the present day? If we could lay out the family tree of Keturah's 6 sons on parchment, it would look like roots spreading in every direction. But on a map, it becomes something even more breathtaking. Starting at Hebron, where Abraham's tent once stood, the sons and their descendants fan out across the ancient world. Zimran, moving southwest toward the Red Sea coast, possibly reaching East Africa and early Nubian trade hubs. Jokshan, dominating Arabian trade corridors, with his sons Sheba and Dedan holding key ports along the Red Sea and Persian Gulf. Medan, settling near Midianite territory, hugging the Gulf of Aqaba and vital north-south caravan paths. Midian, stretching deep into northwestern Arabia, their camel caravans becoming lifelines of commerce and diplomacy. Ishbak, venturing toward Syrian and northern Arabian regions, leaving footprints across desert frontiers. Shua, anchoring in the lowlands of Mesopotamia and Edom's borders, positioned between empire and wilderness. Now picture the overlay of ancient trade routes. The incense roads of Arabia, the spice routes toward India, the copper and gold lines feeding Egypt, and the Silk Road's earliest arteries connecting east to west. Keturah's sons were not tucked away in some forgotten desert. They were positioned like sentinels on the world's economic highways. This means they weren't just moving goods. They were moving culture, religion, and influence. Every caravan was a carrier of ideas, alliances, and, sometimes, spiritual conflict. And here's the stunning part. If these ancient lines on a map were redrawn with today's borders, we'd see that the nations descended from Keturah's sons are still central players on the global stage, in trade, in energy, in politics, and even in biblical prophecy. Which raises a provocative question. If we can still see Keturah's fingerprints on the map, can we also see her influence in the headlines? When most believers read Isaiah 60, they picture a glorious, future Jerusalem, nations streaming to her light, kings bringing their treasures, worship filling the streets. But hidden in this prophetic vision is a remarkable detail, a name we've seen before. If Keturah's sons once moved along the lifelines of the ancient world, where would we find their descendants today? The biblical text gives us the starting points. Ancient history and archaeology fill in more pieces. And while we must tread carefully, resisting the temptation to speak with more certainty than the evidence allows, the patterns are hard to ignore. Jokshan's sons Sheba and Dedan were power players in Arabian trade. Sheba is associated with the incense kingdoms of southern Arabia. In today's terms, think Yemen and Oman, with possible extensions into the Horn of Africa. Dedan's seat was in the northwest of the Arabian Peninsula, in what is now Saudi Arabia, with influence stretching toward the Persian Gulf. Modern mapping would place their heartlands inside the borders of Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and the UAE. Midian's territory, based on biblical and archaeological sources, hugged the Gulf of Aqaba and extended inland, touching modern-day northwestern Saudi Arabia and parts of southern Jordan. Ephah, his firstborn, is specifically named in Isaiah's end-time vision, which suggests his descendants remained influential. Today, these regions remain strategic for global energy, shipping lanes, and religious tourism. This is where we issue the caution flag. We cannot draw a direct family tree from Keturah's tent to a modern passport. Tribal names shift. Empires rise and fall. Borders are redrawn. And yet, the linguistic echoes, the geographic consistency, and the trade route patterns all point to something remarkable. These ancient bloodlines are still in the very regions shaping global politics today. Why it matters? If these identifications hold even partially true, it means that the forgotten wives, children are not footnotes in history. They are key players in energy markets, shipping corridors, religious movements, and, as prophecy hints, the unfolding story of the Messiah's return. In other words, Keturah's descendants are not just in the Bible, they're in the headlines. Her name was Keturah, fragrance or incense. In the Bible, fragrance is never just a smell. It is a symbol of worship, intercession, and a life that rises before God as something pleasing and acceptable. Scripture paints a picture of the kingdom age where the nations bring their treasures to Messiah's throne. Isaiah 60 speaks of gold and frankincense. Psalm 141 verse 2 likens prayer to incense. Revelation 5 verse 8 describes the prayers of the saints as golden bowls full of incense before God. If Keturah's name points to fragrance, and her descendants are shown in prophecy bringing gifts of worship to Jerusalem, then maybe her very identity was a prophetic preview of the nation's role in God's redemptive plan. When we think of the Abrahamic family tree, we often picture two main branches, Isaac through Sarah and Ishmael through Hagar. But the Bible tells us there is a third branch, one that has been almost erased from our collective memory. And that branch is still very much alive. Keturah's sons didn't vanish into the sands of time. They became tribes, nations, and powers positioned along the most strategic corridors of the ancient and modern world. Their territories, from the Arabian Peninsula to East Africa to Mesopotamia, are still at the center of global trade, energy resources, shipping lanes, and religious influence. This isn't just ancient history. When modern Middle Eastern alliances are formed, when trade agreements are signed, when religious movements rise or fall, echoes of Keturah's lineage are there. Isaiah 60's vision of Midian, Ephah, Sheba, and Dedan bringing wealth and worship to Jerusalem hasn't been fully realized. If those names connect to Keturah's sons, then we are watching the pieces of prophecy move into position, even in our headlines today. That means Keturah's story is not over. In fact, it may be entering its most important chapter. Why the church should care. If God preserved even a brief mention of Keturah in Scripture, then he intended us to notice her. Understanding her place in Abraham's family tree broadens our view of God's covenant, reminding us that his plan has always been global. This isn't just about one people or one land. It's about all nations finding their place in the blessing God promised through Abraham. A call to watch and pray. The next time you hear about political tensions in Arabia, trade developments in the Red Sea, or pilgrimages in the deserts of Midian, remember, you might be seeing Keturah's descendants in action. And as prophecy unfolds, it will not be a forgotten wife's shadow in history, but her fragrance rising in worship, fulfilling the promise God made thousands of years ago. We've traced a forgotten name from a few verses in Genesis, through trade routes, ancient kingdoms, prophetic visions, and modern geopolitics. We've seen how Keturah, a woman almost lost in the shadow of Sarah and Hagar, may have carried a prophetic identity in her very name. We've mapped her 6 sons into history, and we've seen how their lands still shape the world we live in. The mystery? Not entirely solved. Because even with all we've uncovered, one question now stands before us. If Keturah's line is rising again, what does that mean for the church? Could the nations of her lineage be part of the great gathering Isaiah foresaw? Could the church be called to engage, bless, or even partner in ways we've overlooked? Or is there a deeper prophetic clash yet to come? These are not just questions for historians or theologians. They're for every believer watching. And your insights matter. Your turn. Drop your thoughts, theories, and even your challenges in the comments. If this deep dive opened your eyes, hit subscribe, share this with a friend, and turn on notifications, because this investigation is far from over. This is more than prophecy. It's a preview. Because if Keturah's forgotten branch of the Abrahamic family tree is part of the finale, then what other hidden figures in Scripture might still be waiting for their moment on the stage of history? That's where our next investigation begins. God bless you.